Welcome and good evening. On behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Jeffery Long as the guest speaker today. Dr. Long is the Carl W. Zeigler Professor of Religion, Philosophy, and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College, located in central Pennsylvania, since 2000. Dr. Long is perhaps not new to Chicago because he received his doctoral degree from University of Chicago Divinity School. He is an award-winning author and editor. He authored books, namely Jainism, An Introduction, and Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. I hope I read that fine. His latest book is Discovering Indian Philosophy, An Introduction to Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist Thought. He has also published a wide array of articles and has spoken at a variety of venues, both national and international, including the United Nations in 2019. Dr. Long is an initiated devotee of the Ramakrishna order and has spoken at various Vedanta societies. And today at the Home of Harmony, he will be speaking on Many Paths, Many Facets, a conversation between Sri Ramakrishna and Jain philosophy. There will be time for question and answer at the end of the talk, so have your questions ready. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffery Long to begin his talk.
Thank you for that very kind welcome. Let's begin with a short prayer. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Parapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Having taken refuge in the lotus feet of the Holy Mother Sharada Devi and the world teacher Ramakrishna, I bow to them again and again. And a Jain prayer. Om Namo Arihantanam, Om Namo Siddhanam, Om Namo Araryanam, Om Namo Uvajayanam, Om Namo Loe Savasahunam. I revere and bow to those who have conquered themselves, to the perfected ones, to the great teachers and preceptors, and to all sadhus in the world. So thank you all for coming today, and I'm especially grateful to Swami Ishadmanandaji for inviting me here, and to this wonderful place, this Vedanta Center, which is not only a Vedanta Center, but is very specifically devoted to the harmony of religions, and transforming this important ideal of harmony from an ideal to something that is lived, right? To something that is an embodied reality. And so it is a great privilege for me to be here. I'm especially excited to be speaking at a center in Chicago because this was my home for many years. I did my master's degree at the University of Chicago and then my PhD also at the University of Chicago. And most important of all, I met my wife, Mohua, who's here taking photos, at the University of Chicago 31 years ago. So it was a place where a lot of very important things happened in my life, a lot of wonderful associations, and so I'm very grateful to be back to, in the words of the old blues song, to Sweet Home Chicago, right? So here I am. I'm speaking today on this topic of many paths, many facets. A conversation between Sri Ramakrishna and Jain philosophy. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with either of these sets of teachings, the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna or of the Jain tradition. So I'll say some introductory things about both. But the reason I'm bringing these two together into conversation relates to something in the title. So there's this wonderful quotation of Sri Ramakrishna, rendered into English here at the base of the statue and the murti at the front of the room. As many faiths, so many paths, right? Yatomat tatopat in Bengali, right? This was a central teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, that every faith is a path to realization. Every faith is a path to the infinite. And so we should be open to all faiths and not dogmatic or prejudiced. And of course, Swami Vivekananda brought this message here to this country, to this city, back in 1893. And in his very famous speech where he begins Sisters and Brothers of America, he talks about a philosophy of universal acceptance, and he would continue to teach that throughout his life. So that's the idea of many paths, many facets. In my pictures over here, I have a picture of depending on how far away you're sitting, you might be able to tell that it's a gemstone, but from too far away it looks like a big blue blob. But it's supposed to be a gemstone. And it has many facets, right? There are many ways that you can look at this beautiful stone. And this is what the Jain tradition teaches us about the nature of reality itself, that it is anekanta, that is not one-sided, has many facets. This means that topics of any kind, religion, but we could even look at this in terms of science or in terms of everyday life, that everything can be approached from multiple perspectives, and that there's some truth, there's some validity in all of our perspectives. I have below that a depiction of the famous Indian story of the blind people and the elephant. I trust many of you are probably familiar with this story. You have the blind people each describing the elephant in different ways based on their limited experience. They proceed to argue about the nature of the elephant. This is like all of us, right? That we all perceive reality from the perspective of our particular frame of reference. We think that's true. It is true, but it's not the whole truth. And we learn that the minute we try to explain it to someone else. And they say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. Because they're doing the same thing, right? So to really comprehend things, we would do well to think of reality as like a gemstone or like an elephant, having many facets, many dimensions, which we can all approach from varied directions. So this system of philosophy, which the Jain tradition developed, is something I think that could be very fruitfully brought into conversation with the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna, because where they unite is in this idea of affirming what is valid in all schools of thought, rather than dogmatically adhering only to one. So that's the basic thesis of my talk today, right? The Jain doctrine of Anekantvada, which affirms the inherent complexity of reality, can serve as the basis for a methodology that is a way of approaching religion and philosophy that invites multiple interpretations of a text, a worldview, a work of art, a philosophical claim, or any element of our phenomenal reality, right? So that's written very much like a professional philosopher of religion. Put more simply, you can use this way of doing philosophy to look at any topic. And you can find that there are multiple valid perspectives and ways of looking at it. So this is the opposite of what in the world of philosophy we call reductionism, what in the Jain tradition they would call ekantavada, that is one-sidedness. The approach that seeks to explain all phenomena in terms of one single phenomenon, right? So reductionism tries to reduce everything down to one thing. In materialism, for example, the idea is consciousness, everything we experience, finally it's just matter, right? It's just atoms, there's nothing else there. Then at the other end, of course, you have the idea that there is nothing but consciousness, and the material world is just an appearance or modification of consciousness. Now, according to the Jain tradition, there is some validity in both of these perspectives, right? When we are thinking in terms of Vedanta, right? In our school of thought, we affirm the idea that all is ultimately consciousness. Everything's a modification of consciousness. And yet, as Sri Ramakrishna often pointed out, on the practical level, in the practical realm, we certainly need to treat the phenomena we experience as real, right? There's the very famous story of the man who was receiving this teaching, all is consciousness, God is in everything, and then suddenly someone came out and cried, there's an elephant coming, he's gone mad, take cover. And so all the disciples went and took cover. But this one man was saying, oh, God is in the elephant too, I cannot be harmed. And he got harmed. He was injured when the elephant came trampling through. And he looked at his guru, he said, Master, you betrayed me. And the master said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you told me God was in everything. And I thought, well, that would include the elephant, but look what happened. And the master said, God was also in the man who came out and said, take cover, the elephant is coming. Right? So, there is a level on which we need to treat material phenomena as real, even if we know that at the ultimate level that's not the case. Right? So Anikantavada is understanding that, right? It's knowing that there is a sphere of validity for all of these different types of claims. So if we oversimplify things, if we try reductionism, it can aid our understanding to some degree. Science very often works through a process of reductionism, right? What are the simplest laws? What are the simplest principles we can use to explain something? But it fails as a total explanation of reality, right? So materialism may explain a lot of things. It's very good at helping us launch rockets into space. But what about the meaning of life? What about the sense of loss we feel when someone passes away, right? There are all of these things to which it is inadequate, right? So if we want to really have an adequate understanding of reality, we need to draw from many sources and understand that all these sources have validity. So Anikantavada and Vijnana Vedanta, right? This is a term that's recently been coined by Swami Vedanta in describing Sri Ramakrishna's distinctive philosophy of Vedanta. These can work in tandem to help articulate a philosophy of religious and philosophical pluralism and cosmopolitanism, right? This is something we really need in the world today. I don't know about all of you, but when I was growing up, the 21st century was the realm of science fiction, right? We were all supposed to be living on Mars and, having incredibly advanced technology do everything for us. Some of that has come true, but some of our most primitive and base impulses have also really come to the fore in the 21st century. And it's become a time of intense ideological fighting, translating into actual physical harm done to countless people. It's become a much scarier world than I think many of us had expected. I know I'm a big fan of science fiction. I don't know about all of you, but I always used to think that maybe Star Trek was a good representation of the type of world we might have someday. But it's becoming a little more like Mad Max, if you're familiar with those films. I think this philosophy can point us in a more Star Trek direction as a species, right? Openness to many paths, many ways of being, many ways of understanding. So where did this philosophy of Anikantavada come from? Well, it came from within the Jain tradition, and I'm going to say a little bit more about how it emerged from the Jain tradition, but I want to say a little bit about the Jain tradition itself as well, for those of you who may be less familiar with it. It's one of the less studied traditions of India in the Western world, unfortunately, because it has a lot of very powerful and valuable lessons for the world today. The Jain tradition, according to a Jain traditional understanding, rather like the Hindu tradition, it's Sanatana, right? It's always existed. There have been many teachers who have become enlightened and taught the Jain path through the eons. According to Jain teaching, within our current world cycle, our current cosmic cycle, Mahavira, the figure depicted here, is the 24th and the most recent, and in fact he will be the last until the next cycle begins. There is a lot of debate among scholars about when precisely Mahavira might have lived. In fact, just this morning I was reviewing a volume of papers from a symposium held in Pune a few months ago on that very topic. Right? What dates did Mahavira live? But according to Jain tradition, it's usually accepted that he lived around the 6th century BC, which would make him roughly a contemporary of the Buddha. And many will argue, based on textual evidence, that he and the Buddha lived around the same time. And the Jain tradition is very similar to the Buddhist tradition. These are both what are called Shramana traditions. Shramanam in Sanskrit means striving, putting forth an effort. So the Shramana traditions are those that are based on putting forth great self-effort to achieve enlightenment, right? They don't focus so much on a personal God. They focus on the ability of the soul itself to liberate itself. And it's believed that through practicing great asceticism, Mahavira attained this goal and then taught the Jain path, and the tradition as we know it today comes from him. So one of the central, actually the central Jain teaching is the teaching of ahimsa, which is nonviolence in thought, in word, and in action. We often translate it as nonviolence just because that's easy. But I think that word does not do justice to the depth of ahimsa, right? Ahimsa is operating on all the 3 levels of our existence, right? Thought, speech, and action. So action, that's hopefully fairly easy to be nonviolent. We're not all, killing ourselves, killing each other all of the time. Nonviolence in speech can be harder. Take a look at social media, for example. I think if everyone observed nonviolence in speech, there'd be much less social media. There'd be, you'd have about 5 tweets a day, and that would be it, right? And then finally in thought, and that's the most difficult of all, controlling our thoughts. Because there are things that make us angry, there are people that make us angry. And it's very natural to translate that anger into a desire to, in some way, strike out at that person, verbally, even physically. But that's the origin of violence. Right? And when we realize that nothing can really harm the soul, nothing can harm the jiva, as it's called in the Jain tradition and in the Hindu tradition, nothing can harm it. So what this person has done, let's say you're driving in Chicago, which I've done a lot in my lifetime, and someone cuts you off in traffic, which is a routine occurrence in Chicago. You could get very angry. You could, shout at the other driver. They don't even know that they cut you off. They're already a mile down the road, right? So what are you doing? You're upsetting yourself. You're disturbing your peace of mind in the presence. And according to the Jain tradition, you're also attracting negative karma that way. The karmas are attracted by something called the kashayas, the passions, as it's sometimes translated. These are disruptions in the inherently peaceful nature of the soul. The best way, according to the Jain tradition, to realize the true nature of the soul is to live like the soul really is. It's peaceful, it's serene, and it's full of wisdom. So Mahavira lived in that way. And in fact, there's the depiction here is a very famous one of a cobra who was angry and came to strike him. Mahavira simply raised his hand in a gesture of peace. Don't be afraid. It's interesting, he was telling the cobra not to be afraid. Now, if you think about that, that seems counterintuitive. Usually we're the ones that would be scared if a cobra was rearing up to attack us. But why is the cobra attacking? Because the cobra's afraid. The cobra's afraid and is trying to protect itself. Fear ultimately is the root of all violence. He tells the cobra, don't be afraid. The cobra finally realizes this being is not going to harm me, and he becomes a protector of Mahavira. And so the central Jain focus is on ahimsa. Many scholars have speculated that the source of this idea of anikantavada is actually connected with ahimsa, right? And nonviolence in thought, word, and action. Violence in speech includes attacking someone else's belief system, attacking someone else's worldview. Now, worldviews conflict, right? We don't all agree with everything that someone else believes or does. I was just talking with my wife. I don't know how the people who originally made this building would feel about the murti of Sri Ramakrishna being up at the front, right? They might not approve of that, right? So we have conflicting views. We say, well, we're here now, we're going to have a murti of Sri Ramakrishna, right? But it's not necessary to aggressively attack someone else's beliefs. It's not necessary to say to someone, your whole belief system, your values, everything you've lived by is wrong, right? Many people feel that as a personal attack. So we have to be conscious of that. So many Jains today will argue that anikantavada is a type of intellectual ahimsa, a way of not causing harm through attacking someone else's beliefs. Mahavira also tended to approach certain questions in a very interesting way. There are these questions that are mentioned in the Jain scriptures. They're also mentioned in the Buddhist scriptures, the avyakta questions, that is the unspeakable, or what it literally really means is unanswerable questions. These are the big mysterious questions of life. What happens to us after we die? Where does the soul go? Does it continue to exist? Do we cease to exist? Does the universe have a beginning? Has it always been here? People would pose these questions to Mahavira, and he would say, in regard to the various alternatives, well, in one sense, it's like this, but in another sense, it's like that, right? He would say both of these answers are correct. So, for example, one of the questions is about the jiva. Now, we translate jiva as soul, but in this context, it would be better to translate it as living being, right? And so if you say, does the living being cease to exist, or is the living being eternal? And Mahavira says, well, if you mean by living being the embodied being, well, that comes to an end, right? It ends. That body dies, and that living being is no longer there in that form. He says, in another sense, it continues to exist because that same essence of the soul, the jiva, continues on and is reborn in another body, right? So they're both correct in different senses. We might all believe very deeply in rebirth, but we still mourn the loss of those who pass away, because that form, that way that we experience that beautiful soul in our lifetime is gone. Right? So there is a finality, and yet there is hope because of the ongoing nature of the jiva. So he took a both-and approach to many questions, and this also scholars will point to as a kind of embryonic version of Anekantavada, right, which later Jain philosophers elaborated upon and built upon. There's also here's a fancy philosophical term, the pluralistic ontology of the Jain tradition. That is, according to Jainism, everything is not reducible to one thing. It's made up of several different substances. These are called dravyas or astikayas in Sanskrit. So you have the jiva, the life force, pudgala, which is physical matter, dharma, which in this context actually is the principle of motion. It's kind of like the rajasic guna in the Sankhya philosophy, if you're familiar with that. Adharma, which in this context is like tamas, it's the principle of inertia. Then you have kala, time, akasha, space. So how is this applied? Traditionally, Jain thinkers have used Anekantavada as a way to conceptualize differences across worldviews. That is, a way to understand why people think different things. Why do people have different beliefs and different views? If the truth is plain and evident, why are there so many competing views? And it's because we're all looking at different facets of a complex reality. And this approach has been illustrated with the ancient parable of the blind people and the elephant, which I mentioned earlier. This story has fascinated me for a long time. I first heard it in my childhood, and I liked it from the beginning. I thought, okay, this makes sense. And I've done some investigation to see who told it first. Because Sri Ramakrishna told it in the 19th century. He has a version of this story. But we see it in Indian texts going back many, many centuries. Hindus use it, Jains use it, Buddhists use it. The oldest version I could find is in the Buddhist scriptures. It's in a Pali text called the Udana. One of the Buddha's students, one of his monks, is in the city, and he hears a group of followers of various traditions debating and arguing with one another. And he becomes very confused. He's like, I have no idea what's true now after hearing these guys. So he goes back to the Buddha, and he tells him, I'm confused. What should I think? Because this group is saying this, and this group is saying that. And in reply, the Buddha told him this story. So basically said, they've all got some good in them, but they're excluding one another, right, which is the problem. In our modern period, many Jains, as I just said, see Anekantavada as an expression of intellectual ahimsa, an application of the principle of nonviolence to the realm of discourse, philosophical discourse. This photo is of a very renowned Jain teacher, Acharya Mahaprajna. He lived in the 20th and early 21st centuries. And you get to see here in his photograph some visible signs of the Jain commitment to nonviolence, also to simplicity, right? He wears a simple white robe. He wears a face mask. This has nothing to do with COVID. This is many years before COVID. In fact, this is the opposite of COVID. He's not wearing that mask to protect himself. He's wearing it to protect the microorganisms and the small insects in the air. Right? So there's a very strong commitment to nonviolence, which Jain ascetics practice. Jain lay people may wear those on some occasions, but it's not something that all Jains do. Anyway, this intellectual ahimsa approach was the approach of Acharya Mahaprajna. He saw Anekantavada as a synthesis of the relative and absolute perspectives. Now, this should be a familiar term for those of you who know Vedanta well, because in Shankara's teaching also we have the absolute perspective, right, the Paramatta Satya, the ultimate truth, and then you have the Vyavahara Satya, right, you have the everyday relative truth, what we might call the practical level of truth. And this dual concept is present in the Jain tradition as well. And what he means by synthesis of relative and absolute is that in Anekantavada you acknowledge the relativity of perspectives. We all have different views because of our beliefs, our life experiences, where we come from, what tradition we grew up in, and so on. But we're also all part of the same shared reality, right? There is some common truth. There is an absolute to which we're all oriented, but we express that in different ways. And so this is his understanding of what Anekantavada does. Mahatma Gandhi was very deeply influenced by the Jain tradition. He was a Vaishnav Hindu, but he grew up in Gujarat, which has a very high Jain population. A good friend of mine, a Jain, very senior Jain layperson in Philadelphia, gave me an interesting statistic a few years ago. Apparently there are as many Jains per square mile in New Jersey as there are in Gujarat. So there's a lot of Jains in New Jersey and a lot of Jains in Gujarat. So Gandhi grew up influenced by Jainism, and as an adult he became very close to a Jain lay teacher named Rajchandra Mehta, and they were very close, and Rajchandra Mehta influenced Gandhi's thought a lot. For him, Anikantavada was a pragmatic matter. It was a matter of learning to view others with sympathy. In an editorial in one of his many journals that he ran, Young India, he once wrote, "Formerly I used to resent the ignorance of my opponents. Today I can love them because I'm gifted with the eye to see myself as others see me, and vice versa. I want to take the whole world in the embrace of my love." This is his interpretation of Anikantavada, that it was seeing things as your conversation partner sees them, so that you have greater sympathy and empathy and overcome differences. This is probably my favorite example of Anikantavada, and I came upon this purely by accident, but I think it illustrates the principle extremely well. We have here 6 photos of the Crab Nebula. The Crab Nebula is a remnant of a star that died long ago. It's many hundreds of light years from the Earth. And we see here that it's been photographed using 6 different wavelengths of light. You see a radio depiction, an infrared, one invisible light, what you would see through a telescope, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. And they all look different. Right? Some of them have commonalities. You can see sort of a shared structure there between, say, the infrared, the ultraviolet, and the visible. But then look at the gamma rays. That looks completely different, right? So when I'm explaining Anikantavada to my students, I will put this picture up and I'll say, which of these is the true representation of the Crab Nebula? Which of these is really the Crab Nebula? Well, they all are the Crab Nebula. And in a sense, none of them are the Crab Nebula because none of them capture the whole thing, right? They just capture that one wavelength. So I think this is a nice way to understand the idea of Anikantavada. We're all looking at different wavelengths of reality, and we're seeing different things. But arguing with one another is not going to do any good. What we need to do is bring the perspectives together, and then we have a multifaceted, we have a deeper and more holistic understanding of the Crab Nebula. And in fact, my favorite depiction of the Crab Nebula would be the one that we cannot see. How does the Crab Nebula see itself? We don't know, right? And it seems like a strange question. You know, can nebulas see? I don't know. Well, but we don't know. So it's better to let that be a mystery. And according to Anikantavada, there is an inexpressible aspect of truth. There's truth that goes beyond words. So turning now to Sri Ramakrishna. How do we connect this philosophy with his life and his teaching? I think the connections are very strong, despite the fact that Sri Ramakrishna himself did not have a very strong acquaintance with the Jain tradition, as far as we know. I've researched this and gotten as much information as I could find, and there's really not a lot. We do know that among the many sacred images that he had in his room, there is a small murti of Mahavira, so he was aware of the Jain tradition. And there's a Jain community in Kolkata, right, the Marwari community, many of whom are Jain. There are accounts of Marwaris coming to Dakshineshwar and meeting Sri Ramakrishna, but based on the accounts, those appear to have been Vaishnav Marwaris because they were there for Krishna Janmashtami, and the Jains would not have been there for that necessarily. So I think the fact that he had very little acquaintance with Jainism actually strengthens what I'm arguing for, which is that this is really a universal truth that he discovered independently through his own experience, and that we also find the Jain tradition discovering through its philosophical process and reflection on the experiences of Mahavira. So Sri Ramakrishna lived in the 19th century, all too brief a time. He was born in Kamarpukur in West Bengal. If you ever have the opportunity to go there, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful place, and you can really kind of sense the living presence of Sri Ramakrishna. And there is a living cousin of Sri Ramakrishna who looks remarkably like him, and he'll stand and pose for a selfie with you. It's just one of the sort of mundane aspects of Kumar Pakora. But that presence of Sri Ramakrishna is still very much there. As we know from childhood, he displayed a tendency toward intense trance states, samadhis, right? The first one we know about is when he was about 6 years old, and he saw some geese flying across the sky. And the beauty of that, the contrast between the white feathers of the geese and the gray storm clouds that were coming, sent him into this state. He had these recurring experiences throughout his life. He became a priest of Ma Kali, the Divine Mother, at Dakshineshwar at the age of 19. He was brought there by his elder brother to help assist him and to learn to be a priest. And then his elder brother abruptly died, passed away. And I think this crisis may be one of the things that made Sri Ramakrishna become filled with a deep longing to see the Divine Mother and experience the Divine Mother directly. And his method was very simple. It was simply directing all of his longing with great intensity to the divine. And he prayed and he cried, and he reached a state where his friends and family feared for his mental health. And then eventually he had the vision that he sought. And in fact, it's wonderfully described in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that what he beheld in that moment was not, in fact, Ma Kali as we see her in her iconography. He saw an ocean of light, an ocean of consciousness. Maybe that's what's represented here by this ocean we have in the front. And he felt overwhelmed by the divine presence, and after that he could see the Divine Mother everywhere. He saw the Divine Mother in all beings. In fact, he caused a mini scandal when some devotees brought food offerings for the goddess. They brought the prasad, and he gave one of the offerings to a cat. And people were very offended by that. But Sri Ramakrishna said, well, my Divine Mother is also in the cat. Why can't I feed her in the form of the cat? Being fond of cats, that's one of my favorite stories from the life of Sri Ramakrishna. After he had the experience of the Divine Mother, this was not enough. And he had an insatiable desire to experience the divine reality in all of its forms, in all of its manifestations. A sage came to Sri Ramakrishna. He had a little silver murti of the boy Ram, Ramlal he called it. And Sri Ramakrishna became completely absorbed in Ramlal. And in his mind, Ramlal came to life. And they would play games, and they would play hide and seek, and they would tell jokes to each other. And it's this very sweet, informal relationship with the form of God. Right? So this was his Ramlal experience. He had a very deep devotion to Lord Krishna. This is a photograph of the murti of Lord Krishna that is there at Dakshineshwar. There's the main Kali temple, and then adjacent to it there is a Krishna temple. And at great expense, this beautiful murti was made, and when it was about to be installed, someone dropped it, and the leg broke. And of course, according to custom, you can't install and use a broken murti for worship. But I think it had cost a lot of money, and they didn't really want to throw it away, so they asked Sri Ramakrishna for help. They said, what should we do in this case? And he said, if your brother broke his leg, would you throw him away? So they took that to mean Krishna's already present in this image. They gave the image to Ramakrishna, who, not many people know this, but in addition to his other many profound qualities, he was a great artist. And he repaired the murti with his own hands, and he did it so well that you really cannot tell where the break was in the image today. When I got to see this image at Dakshineshwar, I was very moved by this. I was seeing something from this story that I'd read and heard so many times. And I noticed, and you can see slightly to the back and to the right, there's also an image of the Buddha. And I asked my guru, who was there with us at the time, I said, is there a significance to that? Is that because the Buddha is one of the avatars, or is there some meaning to it? And he said, no, someone gave that Buddha murti to the temple, and no one knew what to do with it, so they put it there. So sometimes meaning can come from very simple things. Right? So seeing the Buddha there was very profound, but someone just put it there. After his period of devotion to Lord Krishna, he also learned the tantric practices. His first guru was a woman. They call her in the text the Bhairavi Brahmani. Some scholars have said her given name was actually Yogeshwari. And she taught him to see God through the tantric practices. And once he had had that experience, he turned to a completely different tradition, the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. In Tantra, you see the divine in the material world, right? That's the essence of Tantra as a practice. And in Advaita Vedanta, you see beyond the world utterly, right? You see the illusory nature of the world. And he practiced this with a monk named Totapuri. There's a very rare photo we have of Totapuri, who was a wandering Advaita monk. And from him, he was initiated into Advaita Vedanta and had the Advaitic experience. He practiced Islam for a brief period, 3 days. But in that short 3 days, he had very intense experiences, and he had a realization experience. He had a vision, in fact, of the Prophet. And similarly, after listening for many days to stories from the life of Jesus at the home of a devotee, he also had a vision of Christ, very famously. And he embraced Christ, and he absorbed him into himself. So through these many sadhanas, through these many practices in which Sri Ramakrishna devoted himself to different manifestations of divinity, but with equal intensity, he found that through each of these, he could have the experience of samadhi. Through each of these, he could reach realization. So in our tradition, the belief is that he empirically verified the ideal of harmony of religions. He actually practiced each of these until he reached realization in them. So pluralism, seeing truth in many traditions, is foundational to his teaching. There's a very famous quote from the Gospels. He says, "I have practiced all religions, the religions that were available to him," right? Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. "And I've also followed the paths of the different Hindu sects. I found it is the same God toward whom all are directing their steps, though along different paths. The substance is one under different names, and everyone is seeking the same substance. Only climate, temperament, and name create differences." And he goes on to say, "Let each man seek God in his own way. He will surely find him." And he, of course, also tells the story of the blind men and the elephant. Right? Some blind men came to an animal called an elephant. They were asked what the elephant was like. They began to feel its body. One of them said it was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so someone who has only seen one aspect of God will say God is like that only, right? So this is the same basic teaching that we see coming from the Jain tradition. Swami Vedanta has coined this term Vijnana Vedanta. Vedanta is a state that goes even beyond non-duality as we understand it. One perceives that the divine reality has become all things. Right? First you see this world is unreal compared to the infinite, compared to Brahman. And then you realize that this world itself has come from the infinite, has manifested as this world. Sri Ramakrishna says that which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, that is neti, the Advaitic method, in which our dualistic experiences are eliminated one by one. This same reality is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, that is beyond limiting qualities, is also saguna, possessed of qualities. Those who realize this are very few in number. According to Sri Ramakrishna, the ordinary person is not going to become a Vijnani. This is very, very rare. And he said most people who acquire this, in fact, they leave their body very shortly thereafter, because it's served its purpose. They've discovered the ultimate truth. But what's recommended for most of us is to pick a path that fits with our understanding of reality, our personality, and follow that with the utmost devotion. So Sri Ramakrishna's understanding that many paths to ultimate reality can coexist is consistent with the Jain view that reality has many facets. Each corresponds to a worldview and a way of life that is oriented around it. So you follow that way of life, you follow that path, and you'll come to the reality through that means, through that door, as it were, into ultimate reality. Yato mat tato pat, as Sri Ramakrishna himself said. So that's the conclusion of my formal remarks. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. And I think we have time for maybe some questions. I'm not sure. How long have I talked? I don't know. Okay. I think they're bringing a microphone so everyone can hear you. Yeah. There's a gentleman up here as well.
Oh, okay. Actually, in Jainism, the jiva is considered consciousness
The jiva is considered
as a chaitanya or consciousness.
Consciousness. Yeah, the jiva, according to the Jain tradition, possesses unlimited consciousness, unlimited energy,
Yeah.
unlimited bliss. So very similar to the Satchidananda concept that we see in Vedanta, right? That it is pure bliss, it is pure bliss, pure consciousness, pure energy, and pure awareness. That is the ability to basically direct the awareness to any place and develop that full knowledge of that thing to which it's directed. These are called the four infinitudes, Ananta Chatushtaya of the jiva in Jainism. But yeah, consciousness is one of those four.
Yeah, but there are many jivas, not... There are many jivas.
There are many jivas, yes. And this is the biggest difference between, philosophically, that I see between the Jain tradition and Advaita Vedanta. Because in Advaita Vedanta, there is one Atman,
Yeah.
there is one self that, because of Maya, because of our lack of full awareness, has manifested as many jivas, right? In the Jain tradition, there are many jivas. There's many jivas as there are living beings, but they all have the same essence, the same nature. Right? And this gets us into some very deep philosophy, because the same critique that Shankara uses with the Sankhya tradition. Sankhya also says there are many Purushas, right? And Shankara says if there's no difference in essence, then there's really no difference, right? So that would be his critique of the Jain view. And the difference, I think, is the Jain tradition does not sort of embrace the idea of Maya in the same way that you see in Advaita Vedanta. The world is seen as one aspect of reality, not as unreal. So whereas in Advaita Vedanta, you can say that this is all an appearance and consciousness alone is real. So there is a difference between them on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
Yes? Yes. Yeah, he's going to bring a mic for you so everyone can hear your question.
Thank you for the fascinating lecture. My question is that many times it appears that these many facets of the same one reality is not understood properly, or it is misunderstood, and that's why many times the blame is put on the religions, and many conflicts are seen.
Yes.
So basically, the lack of understanding or misunderstanding about these things. So how much progress has occurred in the society after these attempts by the great masters in the religion over a time period?
Right. That's a wonderful question. How much progress have we really made? We have so many great masters teaching that there's truth in many paths, and yet we see people continuing to fight, continuing to struggle. And in fact, my wife and I once, we were in Delhi and we ran into Swami Atmapriyananda. And he told this, when you meet our Swamis, I've had the same experience with Swami Ishanmananda, they'll often make what seems like a chance remark, but it speaks directly to what you're thinking at that moment. And I was having this very concern, in my own life, and I speak about these things, I write about these things, but the world seems to be not getting better particularly, right? So Swami Atmapriyananda spoke to us and said, all these great beings have come, the Buddha, Jesus, Sri Ramakrishna, the Holy Mother, and, there's still so many problems. Who are we to think that we can fix it if they haven't fixed it, right? So that's the first thought I have. But then I think there's a deeper aspect of this as well. One is that the story is not yet finished. Right? We have, so many things have unfolded and have happened through history that we could never have even imagined at one time. And so there is, I think, basis for hope that we can actually take all of this in a better direction. Also, and it's impossible to prove a negative, right? This is a difficulty we have. It could be the world would be much worse if these great beings had not come. Right? So maybe they have alleviated some of what would have occurred if people had been allowed to just kind of run amok, right, so to speak. But then there's also another question of why do these things happen at all? These things meaning, interreligious conflicts, fights, and so on. And here's where I think it's important to really be reflective about the concept of religion. And we hear a lot of very simplistic things said about religion, both positive and negative. And if you study religion at all, you start to realize it's actually very, very complicated. And if we think of the great traditions, this is how Sri Ramakrishna, I think, understood them, as strategies for achieving realization. Right? I'm going to live a certain way, I'm going to think a certain way, I'm going to orient my life a certain way, and it's going to bring about a change in my consciousness. Right? It could be a very small percentage of people who actually practice religion see it that way and practice it that way. Then you have a much larger group of people who practice religion because that's how they grew up. This is what they were taught, and maybe they never questioned it, or maybe they did question it and the answers they got didn't make sense. So some of them turn away from it and turn against it. Others stick with it to accommodate their family and so on. And Swami Vivekananda says it would be better to be an atheist than to follow religion sort of blindly like that. Right? And then because you have a lot of people following religion without a deeper understanding, they're easily manipulated by people who want to utilize these forces of devotion and sense of identity and so on that are wrapped up in religion. That's like nuclear energy, right? It's a massive power that we have within human beings. And unfortunately, greedy leaders, to quote George Harrison, will sometimes manipulate these energies and get people riled up and get them to go and hate and attack some other religion, when ironically that faith that they think they're defending teaches them to do exactly the opposite and not to live that way. Swami Prabhavananda had a great comment about this. He said, if we got all the founders of the world's religion together in one room, they would embrace. And if we got all their followers together, they would kill each other. So that's the difference.
What is your comment about Sri Aurobindo's evolution, what he has given in Synthesis of Yoga or other books?
I like the thought of Sri Aurobindo very much. He's very profound. If you've ever read The Life Divine, it's massive. It's thicker than my hand will extend. But it's very profound. And in many ways, a couple comments on Sri Aurobindo. In some respect, he is very much in continuity with Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And in fact, by his own account, when he was in prison and doing yoga and meditating, he had visions of these great figures. And in fact, some of the ideas which Swami Vivekananda put forth in what we now have as the complete works, he only was on this earth for a very short time, 39 years. So he put the ideas out there, and it was, I think, left to people like Sri Aurobindo to develop it further philosophically. So, for example, my favorite is the concept of involution. Right? We talk a lot about evolution, right? Consciousness emerging from matter, more complex forms emerging from simpler forms. But the opposite is also happening, right? Spirit, consciousness, is plunging into the material world, as it were, and taking on these forms and manifesting. So you have these complementary processes of evolution and involution. So Swami Vivekananda mentions it, but Sri Aurobindo elaborates on it and builds a system. So last comment, too, I would also make about Sri Aurobindo. I've never read another author that I thought had an equally profound grasp of both Western and Indian philosophy, and he perfectly blends them. And he takes a very anikanta approach, right? He doesn't say Indian philosophy is better, Western philosophy is no good, or vice versa. We have plenty of people doing both of those things. He sees them as complementary. He says the West is focused on material evolution, and India is focused on the spiritual involution. So, yeah. Yes?
It always struck me that Jainism isn't a proselytizing religion, unlike Buddhism. Is this, now I don't know if that's correct, but that's my impression. Is this somehow related to this concept that you mentioned?
Yes, it is. It's not an aggressively proselytizing religion. The Jains are quite happy if you become a Jain, that if anyone wants to follow the practice and live the practice, they're most welcome to. But I've met some Jains who actually pride themselves on the fact that relatively few people take it up because it's difficult. It's a very difficult practice. If you dedicate yourself to it fully, this practice of nonviolence it involves a lot of ascetic dimensions. Right? There's a lot that you give up, and so it's difficult. And a lot of people don't want to take that up. I would have a difficult time being a Jain. I realized this when one summer we were at a Jain temple in Hastinapur in northern India, and it was summer, sun was beating down, and to enter the temple there was a gate where you would take off your shoes, and there was a wide courtyard before you actually got to the temple. So I took off my shoes, I started walking across the courtyard, and I felt like my feet were on fire. I was like, I can't do this, right? And we were with a large group of students. So my wife could handle it fine. So she went ahead with a group of about 10 students, and they got to go into the temple and have darshan. I went back to the gate with about 10 other students, and we were all depressed about how inadequate we were because we just couldn't. When you find something that you physically cannot do, it's like lifting a weight that you're putting all your energy into it, and it's just not moving. And this is all to do with our past lives, our sanskaras, our karmas, and so on. And so it's a path I've drawn from deeply. I've learned a lot from it. It's not my path, personally. My path is this path. My path is the one that Swami Vivekananda brought to America for people like me. So that's what I follow. But yeah, it's not been a proselytizing faith to any great extent. There are people who join in. It's not very well known, but when Swami Vivekananda came here to Chicago in 1893, there was also a man named Virchand Gandhi who represented the Jain tradition, much as Swamiji represented Vedanta. And there was a Westerner named Herbert Warren who was so impressed with Virchand Gandhi's teaching that he adopted Jainism. He became a Jain. He wrote a book about it to explain it to Westerners. But it's a difficult path to follow. And like most traditions, people come by Jainism usually by heredity. You're born into a Jain community. But what's interesting is this community has maintained its integrity for all of these hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a small community, but it hasn't gotten absorbed or swept up in any of the big cultural movements or invasions or anything that have happened through India's history. There's always been some Jains, so...
But Jains never sent missionaries abroad, as the Buddhists did, for example.
No,
Why
and
is that?
there's a reason for this, too. It has to do with Jain ascetic practice. Jain monks and nuns have to walk barefoot everywhere. And the reason you walk barefoot is because if you're about to step on a living thing, you can pull back. Right? If you're wearing a shoe, that's not possible. So they have to walk barefoot, and they cannot travel in any artificial conveyance like an ox cart, or much less an internal combustion engine, or an airplane and so on. And so the distance a Jain monk can travel to share the faith is the distance that he can go on foot in one day. And so that's quite limiting in that sense. And also the monks are completely dependent upon the householders for their sustenance. And in the past, there were Jain monks who would go to areas where there were no Jains. And sometimes they would survive and thrive, and sometimes people would take up the path because they'd be very impressed by these men and their way of life. But sometimes they wouldn't find anyone who would be willing to feed them or listen to them. And so they would tend to go to places where there are already Jains. So yeah, you don't have a lot of Jains traveling, certainly Jain monks. Jain householders traveled a lot. A lot of them were merchants, and we know that from literature that there were Jains who traveled to Indonesia, there were Jains who traveled to Arabia, various places, as merchants. But they went as merchants. They didn't go to spread their faith. They went to buy and sell goods and go back to India. So, yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. Loved it. Just one question. Sometimes it kind of fascinates me that Jainism as a religion, the Shvetambars and Digambars, very ascetic people and very, sky-clad. They don't have nothing.
That's
At the
right.
same time, this householder aspect of it, and very successful community.
Yes.
Richest in India, all over the world, highly successful business people.
Yes.
How do we, I don't understand the diversity in there, right? Like one are like totally no money, nothing, no even clothes. And then this other piece where successful business, financially lucrative businesses and all.
Yeah. It's very interesting, that dynamic between the wealth of the householders and the absolute asceticism of the monastic community. And in fact, early in the 20th century, the great sociologist of religion, Max Weber, wrote about this. And now his information about India was not that great, and a lot of this has now been debunked or rejected by scholars. But he had a kind of intuitive, he made an intuitive connection between the Jains and the Protestants of Europe that he attributed with the rise of capitalism. Because there's this very famous book by Weber called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And the basic thesis was that among especially Dutch Protestants, there was a tendency to live a very poor, very ascetic life. But the question in the minds of many of them was, am I among those who have been chosen to be saved, right? They were uncertain of that. And so the belief developed that the sign of God's favor was the size of your bank account. And so they amassed huge amounts of wealth, still living very frugally personally, but enough wealth to basically start capitalism. So Weber's argument was that he claimed to see a similar dynamic in the Jain community, where the ideal is renunciation. But of course, in order to renounce, you need to have something to renounce. So you acquire, and then you do good with that wealth, right? And there is a moral requirement on Jains to use their wealth to put back into the community, to build things like orphanages, hospitals, schools, and animal hospitals. This is interesting too. The first animal hospitals in history, as far as we know, were built by Jains. Said the animals also need medical care. So, you know, if you or anyone you know is a veterinarian, you know, thank the Jains. They started that profession. So the idea is you take that wealth, and that material wealth, kind of analogously to the Protestant situation, it's seen as a manifestation of good karma, right? Punya karma. So you have that wealth, but now you have a responsibility to do something with it. And there's also an expectation that Jain householders, when they get older, will reduce their own living, their own lifestyle to something fairly minimal, either joining the monastic community, or if not that, maybe, you know, living in some small corner of their house while their children, you know, take over the rest, and they live a sort of semi-monastic life and prepare for their next life. Yes, the scholars who've not really been that keen on Weber's interpretation will point out that many of the first people back in the first millennium BC who adopted both Jainism and Buddhism were from merchant communities. So that's just continued on through the families right up to the present day. And why would merchants be drawn to Jainism? The argument is that it's a do-it-yourself religion. Right? So a business person, someone who's used to like living by their own wits and you know, making decisions and so on, the idea of surrendering it all to God might not be very appealing. But the idea that, okay, you can keep track of your karma like a bank account, right? And there are Jains who will keep a record of, you know, their good and bad deeds throughout the day. There are Hindus who do this as well, just to see, you know, honestly, like how am I doing? Maybe I need to improve my behavior in some way. And so that this self-effort aspect of it was very appealing to mercantile classes who lived by their own efforts. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please.
So, is it true that in Jainism you don't believe in the idea of creator, destroyer, or avatar?
That's correct. That's correct. According to the Jain, in that way, the Jain tradition is very much like Buddhism. The belief is that samsara, the cosmic cycle of rebirth, is powered by karma itself and is not in need of sort of a coordinator to ensure that everything runs smoothly, right? In most Hindu traditions, you have the idea that Ishvara, you know, the Supreme Being, is there essentially ensuring that we all receive the karmas that are coming to us, and sort of making all of that cohere as a universe. From the perspective of the Shramana traditions, that's just not a necessary hypothesis. Now, that being said, a good friend of mine, brilliant scholar of Jainism named John Court, has argued that it would be incorrect to call Jains atheists. He says they don't believe in a creator God, but the jiva itself is divine. And the tirthankars, the jinnas, the beings who have attained enlightenment and manifest that pure divinity of the soul, like Mahavira, are worshipped. And there's bhakti, there's songs of devotion to the jinnas. And so there's another friend of mine, Whitney Kelting. She's also another excellent scholar of Jainism. She's written a book called Singing to the Jinnas, and it's a compilation of songs, mostly by women, that she has compiled through her years of doing anthropology among Jains in India. So it's very devotional, and it's there's very much a sense of a sacred reality. But the concept that that sacred reality created the world is not present. It's just, not there. But it's not exactly atheistic. It's a different understanding of God. It's God within, which, of course, we also have in the Vedanta tradition as well. But that's not externalized into a creator. Another interesting aspect of this is that the jinnas, like the Buddhists, also believe that there are powerful beings in the cosmos to whom we can go for help with various things. And so if you go into most Jain temples, you'll see murtis of Ganesha, Saraswati, and Lakshmi. They're all worshipped by the Jains. Not as the supreme being, but as powerful beings who can help us with various aspects of life, as devas. And so there are gods in that sense in Jainism also. But interestingly, they're seen as being not at the same level as the jinnas, who've become enlightened and are now free from samsara.
So they don't believe after moksha you can't come back in a reincarnation. Is that?
No. After moksha, you go to something called the Siddhaloka, the realm of the perfected ones, and you just reside there forever in a state of perfect all-knowingness and bliss, and that's how they understand it. Yeah, the idea of coming back like a bodhisattva in Buddhism is not there. Now, interestingly, when my wife and I went to, there's a wonderful Jain monument in Karnataka. It's called Shravanabagola. It's a massive image of Bahubali. He was the first jinna of our cosmic era. Not the first Tirthankar, but he was the first jinna, the first enlightened being. And in the temple that you go through on your way to have darshan of the big image, there are murtis of the 24 Tirthankars. And I heard a tour guide explaining to people that the enlightened being came down 24 times to show people the path to enlightenment. Now, I didn't want to contradict him, but that's not what Jainism teaches. Right? The 24 Tirthankars each were born as regular people, but then they attained that state through their practice. So they're not avatars in that sense. But if you look at it from a kind of functional perspective, as an anthropologist of religion, they're kind of like avatars. People revere them. There's a list of them. They're supposed to have actually lived in history and so on. So, but technically they're different because they're not the descent of a divine being. They're the ascent of a soul to perfection. All right. Thank you all very much.
It was excellent, and I could feel from the audience so many questions they all wanted to know about. So you have to come again to explain. So many other things are also there. And friends, you all know that the coming 17th August, the many teachers from the different faiths, they will be coming over here to express their views, particularly the peace, on peace, what their particular faith, their scripture, talking about, telling about, teaching about peace. So please come, but that will be the registration, only $20, just to head count, so that we can arrange the lunch for you all. So if you go to our website, You will find that. And if you leave your email address, we will send you all the details. Please register and come. There again, our Mr. Jeffery Long will speak, but not in person, but online. So we will record his talk, and on that day we will show him, and he will be representing the Jainism. So thank you again. Please say Shanti after me 3 times. Om Shanti. 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 Hari Om. Tat Sat.